Steve Miller. I'm an assistant professor here for the last 5 years almost exactly, and before that was at 7 years at NASA Langley. And I did work in the space side. I helped close down shuttle. I worked on Space Launch System and other flight vehicles. And but mostly I was funded by Aeronautics and worked on almost every part of the Aeronautics program. And this presentation today focuses on the original part of NASA and Aeronautics entirely. And if you look at NASA as a name, it's the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So there's national, meaning it's our country. Aeronautics is the first A. S is for space, which is everything else. And administration are, of course, the people who are the decision makers. So let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the Aeronautics Mission Directorate here today, and we'll look at the contributions of aeronautics to society. And really to understand aeronautics and maybe win grants from aeronautics, I think it's important to understand their major goals and thrusts, which are very complicated. There's many layers of management at NASA, and they kind of have like thrusts and programs and projects and people at different levels. And when you write a grant and it goes up there, even though you have reviewers from government and non-government institutions who are anonymous to us, they actually review those on like panels. And ultimately, even if you get the highest review ratings, they might award that grant to maybe someone who came in second or third. They take those ratings really seriously, but they need to look at how the outcome of those grants fit in with these thrusts and projects. So that's really important when you're writing a NASA grant, especially for aeronautics, is to try and tie in the outcome with the mission goals. So that's really critical. And near the end, I'll talk about some of the NASA centers and facilities from kind of what their different focuses are. So this is really focused on the aeronautics. So the great thing about NASA Aeronautics is it's really the oldest part of NASA. It's like the core research core, the research directorates all have aeronautics people, even though, and so if you look at the history, which we'll look at in a second, just notice that the first half of the history of NASA is entirely focused on aeronautics. And of course it was called the NACA, which is how most people in the business call it. I suppose that when you meet someone who calls it NACA, then you know, oh, okay, maybe this person's a new person. So that's one little trick, is when you speak to the older NASA people now, they say NACA, and that's your first step into the door. Little secrets. So, of course, in 2015 actually marked the 100th anniversary of the organization, the NACA NASA, which is really the same organization. And it was really NASA's predecessor. And it all started with a rider to a naval bill, I suppose, where they directed at a $5,000 per year funding to supervise and direct a scientific study of the problems of flight in a view of their practical solution. And then later in 1958, in a Space Act, basically established NASA, and that was really being under pressure from the Soviet Union in the Cold War. So Aeronautics at NASA actually was very kind to publish a number of history slides, and I just wanted to kind of show you a few of these, just so you can appreciate where this organization is coming from, because the history side of NACA and NASA is very important to the aeronautics people because they feel like they're part of history. So I feel like if you communicate with them, then that's a good way to build some repertoire with people in the organization. So if I already mentioned in 1915 there was a rider, and basically each of these slides is about 5 or 10 year blocks, and near the bottom usually you see like world events, and near the top you see more like NASA events. So in 1950 that happened, and a lot of things were happening, and these slides will be shared, so of course you can go in and read more online, or you can just check them out later. And I highlighted a few of these red boxes, like household names and things that were really interesting and I felt happened. For example, in 1921, a guy came over from Germany named Maxwell Monk, and he was one of the world's leading aerodynamicists, and we can look to him to kind of as a leader in our early part of our country and establish America as an early aeronautics leader, after the Wright brothers, of course. Charles Lindbergh was another famous person, of course, 1921. He did a nonstop flight from New York to Paris. Amelia Earhart was involved with aeronautics 1932, beginning the Great Depression. And of course, I'm always interested in women in aerospace engineering. It's something I'm passionate about. And early women actually entered the workforce, of course, as administrative assistants, what we call today secretaries, of course, back then. And the first women computers entered NASA in about 1935 at NASA Langley under the NACA at the time. So there's a wonderful movie called Hidden Figures, which came out a few years ago, which details some of the work that the computers, that is, people did in the organization. Other interesting things, there's a guy named R.T. Jones in the United States. He was one of the first people credited to NASA to develop swept wing theory. This was also invented overseas, but in the United States, he was the first. And of course, anytime you fly on a commercial airline, you're being touched by NASA technology. So you notice that the wings are swept. Of course, there's a whole theory about that, and it was rather controversial at the time, so I boxed it. Another very famous person in the aeronautics world was Richard Whitcomb. He was also a researcher at NASA, and he's probably the most successful one ever. Everybody in aeronautics likely has heard his name at some point, but he developed supercritical airfoils, area rules, and winglets. So now when you fly an aircraft, commercial aircraft, you might look out the window and see at the end of the wing it's tipped up, kind of like birds tip up their wings. Well, many aircraft have tipped up wings now, and those are called winglets, and he's certainly credited with creating that. We might call it also bio-inspired aviation and or aeronautical sciences, and that's because, of course, a lot of people today study bird flight, so people in biology are getting heavily into aeronautics too from all the bio-inspired flight vehicles being birds. Slotted tunnels also came out of NACA in 1951. That was another huge and secretive thing that we kept from the Soviet Union for 15 or 20 years, and it just involved drilling holes in the side of your wind tunnel to reduce shockwave reflection. That's something notable. And all this was great research and contributes to our daily lives even today. But then, of course, the Soviet Union, with Tasagi and NPO Energomash, the rocket engine manufacturer, launched Sputnik. And of course, Sputnik changed the game and really was a catalyst into the formation of what was then the Space Task Group. And what happened was at NASA Langley, all the people got together and they said, okay, in the major hangar, which is still there today right off the Air Force Base, which is Langley Air Force Base, and they said, okay, who wants to be part of the Space Task Group? Well, all the hardcore researchers didn't want to. They wanted to be in aeronautics. But a smaller group of people walked across the floor of the hangar, and they were the original Space Task Group. So just like we have parallel sessions today, the Space Task Group is in the other session. So this is the aeronautics session. So you're like kind of the remnants of that group. Other things that are interesting, so 1958 was really when NACA transitioned to NASA. The Space Task Group was formed and everything, which I just mentioned. And then all kinds of new things happened. And a lot of the aeronautics crossed over with the space research, because of course to go to space, you need to go through the atmosphere. And when you want to land on another planet like Mars, you have to go through the Martian atmosphere. So aeronautics and astronautics were kind of a separate tracks, but that's why we call this field aerospace, because it involves a combination of the two. And certain things happened in the future after 1958, like some higher speed programs where aeronautics like breached the edge of space. And the most famous program, which developed tons of data, was the X-15 Flight Research Program. And that program was just astounding and produced more data than any other flight program besides the Space Shuttle. And I believe that true even in terms of like Apollo, which was a moon landing program. And those types of programs involve people from all disciplines. For example, they even looked at the psychology of pilots, ergonomics, how they sit. So it involves medicine, biology, materials, aerodynamics, navigation. I know there's some astronomy people here with stars. So it had all that. Later on, of course, the United States followed the Soviet Union in terms of the first second person in orbit. Of course, the second spacewalk, second woman in space, second, always second, until, of course, the moon landing in 1969, where the United States is argued to have surpassed the Soviet Union finally. In fact, the Soviet Union actually put a lander on the moon before the United States, though it crashed. It's a minor detail to the Soviet Union. Anyway, after that, it really became a new era in aeronautics and astronautics at NASA because the Nixon administration saw that, the American people viewed that we won the space race because we went to the moon, and both countries were scaling back funding, and NASA funding became sort of like on hold as a political tool. And so you can look at funding graphs, and after Apollo, funding across NASA and all its research went down to a steady level for both Republican and Democrat administration from Nixon until today. So that has not changed, and generally funding has kind of gone up and down, but it hasn't shot up to like an Apollo level mission. Other interesting things is the first free flights of space shuttle, and a lot of us, like people my age, I was really born in the same year the space shuttle first launch, almost the same month even. And so I grew up with that, and my first job at NASA was helping to document and close down the space shuttle, and I have a little thing in my office that acknowledges that. And so I was in the transition period from space shuttle to commercial space. And commercial space, of course, also involves aeronautical work and astronautic work. For example, how do we move the flight vehicles from the launch pad to orbit? That's a huge problem in itself, and of course where most things traditionally go wrong is on ascent or descent into the atmosphere. Once you're in orbit, things are generally pretty happy. Very few accidents have happened in actual space relative to the atmosphere. So it's very important for safety reasons, and it's all-encompassing. Just another couple slides. In aeronautics, I try to highlight aeronautics things. Hypersonics is in the news today. It's a huge field and very interesting, and it's exploding in terms of all types of technology. In 1990, for a number of years, there's a high-speed research program to try and bring, of course, high-speed vehicles to mimic Concorde and the Tu-144 from the Soviet Union. Also today, battery technology, electric propulsion are huge, and some parts of the aerospace industry are growing there. And of course, NASA did early work there with solar-powered flight, sustained flight, which I marked there. That's actually a Smithsonian flight vehicle. And we also have hypersonics programs, which I highlighted, which were groundbreaking at the time, like a Mach 10 sustained flight X-43A. So that's something I'll talk about today, is the current emphasis on all these types of programs and how it relates to it. Probably most recently for subsonic transport, that means like for people like you and me who get on a subsonic aircraft, like a two-big wing aircraft like right here over on the right, you might see other types of designs. So NASA's looking at all kinds of aeronautical things, from the big picture systems, navigations, controls, materials, the people, the human factors, the biology. Everything is in aeronautics because it's really a system problem. And you can operate down at the fundamental level or come all the way up to like a systems approach and bring people in. And we'll just look at all that. So that's the brief history of the agency. Now I want to look briefly at kind of just some of the technologies on everyday vehicles and some more exotic vehicles like a military aircraft that NASA Aeronautics has developed over the last 100 years. So I just kind of want to just point out how some of the very specific technologies are on typical aircraft. So here's kind of a generic tube and wing type commercial aircraft. We call them tube and wings. It's like a tube and has some wings. That's sort of slang in the industry. And one, of course, is computational fluid dynamics. So the computers, which were often young women, and they actually had to be unmarried young women living in a boarding house to be a computer at the NACA and NASA, were replaced by the digital computers. And the digital computers could, of course, do many more calculations. And the first ones were for structural work, to assess materials and structure and design of the internal part of the aircraft, which you rarely see as a commercial aviation passenger. In the 70s, the computers got even more powerful and were able to do computational fluid dynamics simulations. That means we were solving the aerodynamic portions of the problem, of course, with computers. So those are the two main things the digital computer revolution created and are continuing to advance today. And that is a field which you'll find people at almost every major university working in. And it's becoming multidisciplinary. They're working in like design algorithms and all kinds of other things into the programs. Glass cockpits just replace like mechanical instruments. And there's a whole list of things in here you can see in the slides when they're handed out. The business jet world is a parallel track to the commercial world. So here's your typical business jet, and there's lots of the same crossover technology. For example, earlier I mentioned the researcher Richard Whitcomb. Well, you can see a typical jet has a supercritical airfoil. That means it's designed to work well in the transonic regime. It also has winglets, which you see on almost all aircraft today, and even some helicopters and hypersonic vehicles. It also has like digital fly-by-wire. It was a huge deal to take away the hydraulic systems and mechanical systems to control the aircraft and replace it with like electromechanical actuators. And pilots were very against it. And then they integrated flight computers into the controls. This was also a huge change, which met a lot of resistance in the aviation community. Aviation being like pilots and passengers and the industry of aviation. Aeronautical sciences is like goes along with this, the science part of the industry. So those are things that took a lot of business decisions and market forces and maybe a generation of pilots to overcome. And now it's well accepted, and many people wouldn't want to necessarily fly a passenger jet without these types of systems, or even be allowed to. Then there's the military world, and NACA and NASA have both worked closely over the history of the organizations. In the early part of the 1900s, of course, the Army was running aircraft for surveillance, and they would look to NACA for work. In the Cold War, NASA and the DoD, all parts of the DoD work closely with NASA, and today it's true. And in my own personal career, a lot of Air Force and Navy people came through my offices and the offices of my colleagues. And a lot of NASA people are very proud that they never turned down research questions or investigations to work hand in hand. So that's one thing to remember. If you are doing DoD work, you might be able to leverage that and bring over to the NASA, as long as you can explain how that research fits in with their goals, which we'll be looking at. I have a lot of slides to understand the thrusts and goals and major objectives of NASA. And there's a lot of it, and you really need to understand that to try and leverage and get in a large NASA grant or even a small source grant. Rotorcraft is another area. A lot of people say that if you understand rotorcraft or rotorcraft aerodynamics or structural dynamics or anything, then you really understand the whole subject. And it's really true, because a rotorcraft is unique because of course, the lifting surface is your control surface. And these are just a few things, but I wanted to highlight crashworthiness. And a lot of crash testing of helicopters happens because one of the number one reasons people in the DoD didn't come back from Afghanistan was because their helicopter was shot down, and when it landed, they passed away in the crash. So there's a lot of DoD applications in safety and crashworthiness, and that's true for civilian application too. A lot of medical flights, some have high rates of crashes relative to other types of helicopter flights, and we would like to have those people have a higher rate of survivability. Anyway, that being said, air travel is still one of the fastest and safest ways to travel, much more than like automobiles. And I know a lot of people know someone who's passed away in an automobile accident, but very few people know anybody who's passed away in an aviation accident. And that's because of safety is always on the forefront of everybody's mind. So anything you do, no matter if it's like bio-related aeronautics or traditional aeronautical work, like in fundamental equation development, you're always thinking about the implication of safety. So that should also be integrated with the grants. There's also these tilt rotor aircraft, which are kind of a combination of flight vehicle, forward flight, fixed wing, and rotorcraft. But anyway, those are just some big idea pictures of what comes out of aeronautics. And I didn't really show any of the space stuff, but there's also, of course, all the launch rockets and everything. They leverage the aeronautics people to get through the atmosphere and entry, landing, and descent, and ascent. So now I want to turn my mind towards the ARMD goals and research thrusts. And this is going to be a bigger part of the presentation where we look at, hey, doing all this research over the next 10 to 30 years, what's the outcome? And NASA publishes this on our websites and all kinds of different places, and I spent a lot of time trying to collect all this. And they say they have 6 major thrusts, and here they are. I put them in the box for you from a NASA slide. And one is, of course, safe, efficient growth in global operations, innovation in commercial supersonic aircraft. So they want to return to commercial supersonic flight. not like the Concorde, but have the same goal as the Concorde, right? They want to have to do it safer, more efficient, more environmentally friendly, and to have lower sonic boom. And we'll talk some more about that. They look at ultra-efficient subsonic transport, so that means taking your tube and wing aircraft and maybe modifying them to be more efficient, greener, lower emissions, higher safety, integrated with a bigger aerospace program, which is a huge issue in aviation right now because passenger growth is growing so much, especially in Asia and the United States. We also want to make things safer, quieter, and more affordable in vertical lift. So we want, that is by we, I mean the NASA goal is to try and integrate vertical lift into the society more. And we'll look at some examples in some of my own research and people at UF doing that. Safety insurance, like real-time safety assurance, the air transportation system is the same one that it was decades and decades ago. And it's very rigorous, and we have very few accidents in our country relative to other countries for aircraft safety, and we share these safety goals with other countries, so it's a collaborative effort. But we want to upgrade it in terms of what we call the next gen system, which we'll talk a bit about. And then the last one is assured autonomy. And you might notice all these little UAVs or drones flying around without pilots, and a lot of them don't have anybody behind the controls. So for example, in some countries they do drug delivery by drone, and nobody's really monitoring or flying it. The DoD is absolutely interested in having UAVs or drones, depending on what you want to call them. There's lots of names, where there's really no pilot, and they make their own decisions with artificial intelligence and communicating with each other in like swarms. So these are all things being looked at and worked at today, and that's also part of the NASA vision. But remember, NASA's civilian. So even though they're working with DoD and all the airframers and aerospace corporations in the country and certainly other parts of the world, they always have a civilian outcome. So all these major thrusts are civilian related, but certainly you can leverage other agencies to get more involved. Just some facts about Aeronautics Research Mission Directorate. It is true that every U.S. commercial aircraft and air traffic control tower has NASA-developed technology. So every time you fly, there's not a lot of people I haven't met who've flown today have benefited from these research programs, which take decades to accomplish and bring onto a flight vehicle. Everything in the future should be more environmentally friendly, and not environment just doesn't mean like emissions or global warming. It also might mean noise. So aircraft have gotten a lot quieter, they've gotten a lot faster, and they've gotten a lot safer. Safer is always the first priority. And in this thing on the right is actually an FAA NASA slide. They're working together to create next gen, and they're just showing how everything's integrated from space down through the ocean and airports into an integrated system. And it's extremely complicated, but a huge effort to upgrade the nation's air traffic control. So I wanted to also mention here that there's 4 major research centers, which I'll talk about at the end of this presentation. I have a slide for each about their history and location and what they do, so that you can try and identify, hey, this is my research area, and how would I like to get involved with the NASA Aeronautics Research Mission Directorate? You should probably look for people via search engines who are related to your area and just reach out to them. It's because, of course, they can have program managers that you might want to interact with, or even if you're really good, you can get sole source funding, and they just directly give you funding without a competition. NASA also has a strategic implementation plan, which sets the goals for the next 25 years and beyond, and you'll see that through a lot of these different emphasis, which I just showed in this set of slides. But you'll always see that there's a theme of things being safe, efficient, flexible, and environmentally friendly. So almost all research I can think of, you can try and explain its broader impact to help those, at least one of those 4 areas. I think it'd be hard not to. I just want to talk for a second and convey to you, like, financially how important the aviation and aerospace industry is in the United States. The United States is the global leader in aerospace, but that could be slipping away because of our, maybe what's happening in the commercial sector in Europe. Airbus is a growth company. They're doing really well. And of course, in the People's Republic of China, they're ramping up all sectors of aerospace. And they're both going to be major competitors in the future. But it is true, aerospace drives the global economy, especially during the recent COVID pandemic. Everybody had shipping. And it's very likely that you received many packages through the air and aviation, which has benefited from all this research and will benefit from more research. And so, of course, it's developed in a safe, high-speed global transportation system and about for $1.6 trillion of economic activity in the United States. And it does actually provide a nice, rare, and happy trade balance for the United States. We're still a major exporter of aerospace, commercial and DoD. And the NASA technology is all part of that transition. There's also about 11 million people who have direct and indirect jobs. And there's an organization, which is an international organization, which many countries are in through the United Nations, called the ICAO. And they say, in this quote, which I pulled out from a report, they said, of the 5 million direct jobs generated by the air transport industry worldwide, 4.3 million people are employed by the airlines and airports globally, contributing around 275 billion of GDP to the global economy. And air transport itself, not all the other things I've mentioned, but just air transport, generates a total of 13.5 million jobs, which is an astounding number of people. So we have a large impact of anything we do to improve anything in aviation through this. There's about 21 million tons of freight moved through the air in 2018, and it's grown, of course, in the last 3 years by tremendous amounts, and accounting for almost 1 billion passengers. And not far from now, we'll be doubling the number of yearly passengers in the United States. Certainly more than double by the year 2030. So how are we going to have an airspace system from decades ago which can handle all this without having environmental detrimental impact? It's a huge problem, and I think the people at NASA have thought carefully about this and fund research to try and solve that greater picture. So you can do research in many different fields, which kind of helps relay this problem. And I pulled out this photo published by Delta, where they're transporting COVID vaccines. And of course, many people have been fortunate to receive a COVID vaccine in the world. And they were often flown by air because of their short lifespan. So that's another thing that benefited vaccine distribution. We wouldn't be able to do that before this happened. Just a few other thoughts on ARMD and aviation in general. Most of the growth is going to be in the Asia-Pacific region, and it's really fun to look at Flight Global, which is a website where you can see real-time air traffic. And I'll have a picture of this later for the United States. But in the United States, we kind of frankly, a sparse air traffic system compared to, say, China. In China, the traffic between city pairs almost looks like a train or a line. There's so many aircraft, one after the other. United States, like for Gainesville to Atlanta, for example, we have a couple of flights a day, a few flights a day. So it's pretty sparse. And so that means a lot of the growth is really overseas, but the U.S. probably will remain a world leader as long as we focus on our research and technical excellence and, frankly, aerospace technology superiority, which is part of aeronautics. Okay, so those are the major thrusts. And how do they, where do they come from? Well, a lot of people have thought a long time of what these thrusts come in, and they call them mega drivers. And there's 3 things that they feel like are really driving everything, especially in aeronautics. And one is the global growth and demand for high-speed mobility. People's time is very valuable. And if you think about it, people like Heisenberg and Dirac, who are great scientists, they took a boat from California to Japan, and they spent weeks on the boat. And Heisenberg was goofing off and dancing, and Dirac was in his room doing mathematics. Both of them might have benefited by just being on an airplane and taking their multi-week trip into a few hours. That's what it means today. 100 years ago, we think about how long it takes to travel. And now we think of a trip on an airplane of 10 hours or 12 hours, go to the other side of the world. It's a humongous time. So of course, people demand shorter times on the aircraft and shorter passenger times. And that's where high-speed mobility is driven. It's consumer-driven, market-driven. Market forces are driving this need for research. We also want to make it more affordable. and more sustainable and safety and have safe flights and use lower energy use? Well, you got to pay. If you want to go faster, usually you got to use more energy. And so maybe there would be like a mixed system of aviation where you have some people flying on a smaller, higher speed supersonic aircraft, kind of like the Concorde was, and also larger aircraft, which maybe are electrically driven and more environmentally efficient. And so often the systems of transportation and aviation, what drive these technologies, are actually kind of a multidisciplinary flight vehicle approach. And the last one's more of a catch-all. And I realize a lot of successful grants written at universities are actually multidisciplinary teams. And to solve these difficult problems, they have to be multidisciplinary. They're like systems problems in terms of aerospace nomenclature. It's a systems-driven problem and solution. And so we get people from all kinds of different fields that come together and propose. And this can be done through the university environment through the university-led initiative, which I'll talk about near the end of this presentation. So let's look at each of these drivers and just pull out what NASA sees as the future and what's important. And I put in a picture of the congestion in Atlanta, which is the busiest airport in the country. But aviation and aeronautical science is not just about tube and wing commercial aircraft, the major hubs. And you'll see that here. So of course, every year there's about 7 new Chicago-sized cities which need air transportation, and demand is growing. Passengers in the world, this is a conservative estimate today, this is outdated by a few years, will double in 2034 in the United States. Obviously, environment's a major concern for most people in most of the world, and they want to try and power aviation by renewable energy sources. And this is a case where I see a lot of the people in biological sciences and the engine community, which are 2 traditional communities, really coming together to try and create renewable energy flight or zero emission flight in maybe 20 years or 25 years realistically. Also, there should be other types of ways people can travel and move around. Some are going to be with electrically driven vertical takeoff vehicles, which I'll talk about today, and also things like with smaller drones for, say, goods delivery. Like Amazon has a whole aerospace wing, actually, in their company to develop package delivery using drones, and you can read about that in the news. The second one, of course, is affordability, sustainability, and energy use. On the right, you can see that fuel actually rose by a factor of about 6 between 1990 and 2012, and it continues to rise. So fuel costs and insurance are the 2 biggest costs for aviation industry. And if we can use something other than fuel to propel aircraft, that's wonderful. As the energy source, maybe that's like batteries. That's something people are looking at. So the battery research and technology has to really come forward to make this dream come true. It's really the one major factor that really holds us back. And of course, how do you charge these batteries and get energy into them, of course. But the other major benefit, of course, is having zero emissions. No emissions is that you won't be dumping all these greenhouse gases and other combustion byproducts, which there's so many harmful ones in the upper atmosphere. So that's really what this environmental slide is on the right is really all about, is how do we stop dumping all these harmful chemicals in the upper atmosphere. And there's lots of interesting studies that show that dumping these kind of byproducts of combustion in the upper atmosphere has a way, way worse effect than dumping them, say, in exhaust on the runway. And even though the aircraft might only directly, by estimates, contribute, about 2% of these emissions overall, they about have maybe like a 5 to 6% effect overall on global warming. The third major driver, of course, is technology convergence, which I just mentioned, and I won't spend too much on this slide, but that's just like taking absolutely everything, any discipline, and trying to push forward the fields. And that's really where it's open and more creative, I think, than maybe the traditional areas of aeronautics. And so if you have a great idea, you can go through ULI, which I'll talk about later, and form a team and try and solve these. And, on the right, here's one example of technology convergence from NASA's point of view, which is, of course, the Internet of Things for aviation. Internet of Things have been a while. For example, your refrigerator and microwave might be part of the Internet of Things and tell you when you need more food in your fridge or whatever. Everything's connected. Well, they want to connect the aviation aerospace industry into this giant network. The benefit, of course, is that you can create digital twins. So right now, for every aircraft out there, they're collecting, an engine especially, they are collecting in real-time data. And they construct digital twins and predict failure. So this is one example where aerospace is really leading in the construction of new technologies like digital twins. Massive amount of data, big data is being collected to construct these and to predict failure. And I think it's increasing safety a lot, and it's really helpful. Okay. Now, it seems insane, but we just talked about like the three major, like goals, and now they also have 6 thrusts to meet those. And I think this is a big part of what NASA does, is trying to predict and create the future through these types of things to try and guide researchers in what they're doing, how they're connected to it. So these thrusts are really related to the previous slides: safe, efficient growth and operations, innovations in commercial flight, ultra-efficient subsonic transport, safe, quiet, affordable vertical lift, time, system-wide safety and insurance, and of course, autonomy. I've already talked about all these topics, so we won't spend more time on them. But you should be aware of them and try and connect your proposal or idea or research idea to these. Because when your grant's approved to go forward and goes up to headquarters to get stamped, they look at this and they want to see it. And I've already mentioned a few of these things, but I'm going to give examples of the major programs behind each of these strategic thrusts. NextGen, for example, is the next system for air traffic control. It receives considerable funding and involves lots of different fields. It's not just like an operational thing. But this is something where a mathematician or an industrial engineer or someone who's excellent optimization with psychologists can just thrive, because there's a lot of psychology of the pilots and how they interact and communicate with the ground too. They want to be able to open up aerospace to even more people at a lower rate. For example, the 1950s, 1940s, if you flew commercially, some flights would be like buying a car. Today, it's only a few $100s. So you can see the price per access for people to get into aviation is decreasing. This is the exact same thing that's happening in commercial space. In commercial space, we're starting to sell seats on rockets and flight vehicles that go up maybe 100 kilometers or so. And that's very expensive. But maybe in my career, maybe I can afford some sort of commercial tourist flight to space. And so the same thing that happened in aeronautics and is continuing to happen to make it cheaper and more affordable is also happening on the space side. Here's actually a strategic thrust graph. NASA publishes these for every one of them. So when the calls come out through NSPIRES, which I'll talk briefly at the end, I think we have other discussions that in these sessions, you'll see, and they'll discuss how it's related to these thrusts and overall agency goals. Or they might even say, don't worry about that, don't talk about it. So I've seen both calls. But if they do, that you can just go on NASA's website and go under the program that's doing the call and look up these graphs, and you can just pull up the wording and talk about how your grant or proposal is related to these particular subjects, which is really nice. So in this thrust, it's obviously fully focused on overcoming these capacity, efficiency, and safety limitations. And here's the graph. So they have research themes. That's actually what NASA's doing, which they might be funding to try and bring this about. But they're open to new ideas too. And they often project in the 2035 timeline. These were created in 2015, so we're kind of right here in each timeline, right before 2025. And they just want to bring in fully autonomous trajectory services, bringing the humans out of the loop, mostly in the air traffic control system. So here's one example I pulled out from the Air Traffic Management Lab near Dallas. And they bring in pilots, commercial pilots, general aviation pilots, air traffic controllers from all over the country and world, and they try out the new systems and see what happens. So they're doing experiments with people. This involves, of course, many things like human factors, systems, optimizations, computer science, hardware, with aircraft, trajectory, tracking aircraft, radar, you name it. So it's a wonderful program to get involved in if you want to kind of shape that future. And probably a lot of people have research related to that, and they're just not connected with that. Here's the second thrust, commercial supersonic transport. So supersonic means vehicles moving faster than the speed of sound. And that's one case there on the right. That's the Concorde, which is a previous generation. There's also Tu-144, and the HSR program in the United States never really worked for a lot of reasons. So in these, they want to remove the environmental impacts of supersonic aviation and increase safety. Safety was a huge issue with Concorde. There were a few minor accidents, but the biggest thing was just economics. It was extremely expensive to fly on the Concorde, and it's very rare to actually meet someone who took a Concorde flight. And many people would actually go to fly to Europe on a tube and wing subsonic aircraft and fly the Concorde back, just for the experience. And it would cost a lot of money to get a seat, between $4,000 and $7,000 when the Concorde was flying. It also had huge impacts on the traditional environment in terms of noise and sonic boom, and the new programs try and reduce sonic boom in those aircraft. So here's the current program. This is the NASA X-59 program. I actually worked on supersonics a lot when I was at NASA. On the right is at Lockheed Martin. You can see it's part of the basically the airframe and fuselage. You're seeing the interior structure. On the left, you're seeing what the final vehicle will look like. So these slides are a little bit older, and this flight vehicle, which is an X-plane, meaning X for experimental, we would never fly on this ourselves. It's just a single aircraft, single pilot experimental vehicle. And they're going to prove that this supersonic aircraft can fly with low boom, meaning low sonic boom, and so it'd be allowed to fly over land. So this is a huge effort. Multidisciplinary, and it's one of the major programs at NASA, which I'll point out. Here's their typical timeline slide with research themes, and they even provide quantitative metrics of their goals to achieve these goals, and those are shown on the right. For example, their cruise speed is between Mach 1.6 and 1.8. Concorde was Mach 2.2, I believe, and in the far term, they would want to have overland flight up to Mach 1.6. So just by flying a little bit slower, but still supersonically, they also achieve low boom. And you can always look here. This is the critical point of where they want to be in 2035. And I assume they'll be updating these in 5 to 7 years. Third major one is, of course, increased efficiency for the subsonic transports. And that means noise, emissions, growth, alternative energies, alternative jet fuels, electrify propulsion, take combustion out of the equation. I doubt that will happen in the military sector at all, except for transport. And of course, reductions of cost, doing digital twins, improve materials and structures, and of course, integrate all this and make it happen through market forces, which is the greatest driver of change, in my opinion, and hopefully not contribute to the global warming effect. So here's one interesting example of the NASA vehicle. This is ultra-efficient subsonic transport, and at the back, this is basically a tube and wing aircraft, which they're basically trying to say we're going to have batteries and electric propulsion through a fan, and they integrate this. This is actually called like a Goldstein pump jet, and they integrate it with the tail of the aircraft because it adjusts the boundary layer, which is more aerodynamically efficient. So just by making these small changes, you can still use the well-liked by industry tube and wing aircraft configuration, but have a way more efficient aircraft, which has basically no emission. And a lot of people are designing smaller aircraft these days because larger transports like the Airbus 380 were not successful. So we're looking at smaller regional jets. In thrust 3, we have ultra-efficient subsonic transports. On the right, we have another X-plane, the X-48B. This was actually unmanned. And I think it was a collaboration with Boeing. I actually worked a bit on this project too, not just the supersonics one. And this is where they're really getting away from typical tube and wing aircraft and actually blending in the whole wing. This concept, of course, came out of Northrop Grumman, which is a company most people know in the world as a major aerospace company in the United States with, like single flying wings. Well, this is like a combination between like the tube and wing and the flying wing configuration. It's hybrid wing bodies. And these have lots of structural technology, materials, engine integration, propulsion, and they're certainly more efficient and maybe even carbon neutral on an entire system basis when you look at it. This is just a graph to try and show their projections that with all these technologies combined, and if you were able to deploy hovering wind bodies, then you would actually retrieve some carbon neutrality in the aviation sector by 2040. So that would be a huge win for everybody. Here's the strategic thrust slides timeline on the left. And once again, they give specific metrics for noise, emissions, and fuel burn. So if you have anything to do with any of these areas, then this is a great program to get involved in. It's well-funded and a long-term program, and one of the bigger programs in aeronautics, because there's such a big impact on the world economy and market. Next, there's really rotorcraft, which they call vertical lift. And this goes all the way back to Leonardo da Vinci and people like him, where they observed little biological seeds coming down and they spin. I forgot exactly what those seeds are, but they're really beautiful. And these types of things inspired a lot of people to think about, like, oh, if we have an air screw, which is much like a propeller in the water, or like the pumps they had in Egypt in about 3000 AD. And they said, well, if that works for liquids, why not apply it to air? And so a lot of people started designing rotorcraft, that is, blades that are spinning to create lift. And there's Leonardo's design on the right. Well, for all these types of rotorcraft programs, it's very curious and it's interesting to think about how do we decrease the noise, increase the safety, increase the speed, reduce emissions, and create new types of rotorcraft in society. And those include like package delivery by drones, or just all the drone technology for photography, or drones for general aviation, or UAVs in the military, which are propeller or rotorcraft based, or even tilt rotors. And how do we also integrate them in our normal travel? For example, why should people drive to the airport from 80 miles away? They could actually take a vertical lift vehicle that's electrically driven. And that's part of a big movement, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Of course, here's one nominal vehicle designed, just artist rendition many years ago based on some studies, and you can see it's sort of a smaller vehicle that's integrated with suburban environments or city environments to move around. And this has been thought about for a long time, even with flying cars in the 1940s and 50s. And this is probably what they're going to start looking at. And if you look at China, Europe, and the United States, there's a number of well-funded companies, over $1 billion, teaming up with Boeing and Airbus and private equity, angel investors and all this business, where they're funding these companies. And that's part of our research here at UF too. Here's a typical timeline. It just basically means hey, we're going to have these vehicles integrated into society. I've already talked about system-wide safety assurance previously. I'll just show this here briefly in the interest of time. But really they're looking for, by 2035, real-time safety management, and they have a number of research themes which people might get involved in, from monitoring, assessing, mitigation risk, and of course demonstrating all this before it goes into a system. So I find this work to be really interesting. It involves everything from sensors, big data, which of course we're becoming very highly involved at UF. Artificial intelligence would certainly be integrated, which is another thing at Florida and many other universities are looking at. And this is just another of many applications for the people coming into this university in that field. So this is an interesting area to get involved in. The last thrust, again, is the assured autonomy for aviation transform. These has a lot of the same themes as the previous thrust in reality, but it's just a tiny bit different. I mean, this is autonomy. You have seen a lot of work about self-driving cars. That's a type of autonomy that's been going on for decades. Autonomy in aerospace is kind of interesting because certainly there are some flight vehicles that have been flying basically on autopilot. And they often have a human monitoring, but they're very trustable and verifiable. Maybe we had more success in aerospace in the DoD side than we have in the commercial side for driving cars. But nonetheless, this technology is here and it's going to stay, and it is growing still in aerospace. So anybody working in that whole autonomy world in any facet of it can get involved in the aerospace side and commercial or military side. And here's my last timeline slide on their last thrust. And again, to remind you, if writing grants for this, it's always good to bring up this chart and just have like a paragraph explaining about how it's related to these things. And this is also an area which is really interesting in terms of like ethics. There's lots of people studying ethics and philosophy and legal issues and PR, marketing, and public acceptance. And all these things and all these areas are part of the research portfolio in Thrust 6 for autonomy, because obviously in aerospace, there's huge ethical decisions being made when we fly, which can also be drawn in from the studies from the automotive industry, for example, for autonomy. So I would encourage anybody that, like, this is a case where someone in the law school can get involved, or philosophy, for instance, for ethics. Very interesting. So those are like the big management directions for NASA. You might say, okay, well, what about the programs? Well, there's a few different programs. Here's 4 ARMD programs. So under Aeronautics, there's Space and Aeronautics. Under Aeronautics, there's 4 major programs. The first is Airspace Operations and Safety, the Advanced Air Vehicles Program, the Integrated Aviation Systems Program, and the Transformative Aeronautics Concepts Program. And they each have their own head and their own staff. And under these, there's going to be the projects, and each project has a project manager. So you've got a program manager and a project manager. Usually grants are given to you by the project manager through a NASA research announcement, which we'll look later. So you kind of have to understand that structure a little bit, so that, hey, maybe you want to send an email just saying, introducing yourself and saying, yeah, this is my research area. I'm looking for NRAs and opportunities or sole source funding. And you can find these folks through, of course, search engines. So let's look at a few of them and just look at their major goals so you can understand where to look. The first is Advanced Air Vehicle Program, and their goal is to enable new aircraft to fly safer, faster, cleaner, quieter, and more fuel efficient. So you're seeing the theme. See, the projects and programs are going to be connecting their work through the NASA goals set by the administrator and Congress and political input. Under this program, they have a number of projects, and it's the project managers who are probably the most important person in like approving a grant to be awarded. They approve it, and basically the upper management rubber stamps it if you've related your work to their goals. And in there, I'll just talk about these briefly. These are the most traditional areas of NASA. The original part of NASA all sits in here. Let's look at them. But before that, I just wanted to mention, under each of these projects, they have their own goals. So you see there's lots of layers of management. At the end of the day, don't worry too much about it. Just focus on what you do, how you want to get involved. Once you identify that, you can reach out and direct your input to that particular person. So here's just some examples of their technical goals. And I'll let you read them on your own. You can look at, say, low NOx fuel flex combustors. So they want to create new combustion chambers for their air-breathing engines that go on jets, which have lower NOx output. In fact, they used to have a lower CO2 goal, which is interesting because that's a pretty natural byproduct. So here's another slide for another program, the AAVP, which we just looked at. They're looking at a lot of these things, and here's some examples. They got a supersonic aircraft, drone technology, truss-based wing. These are all pretty typical. On the Commercial Supersonics Transport Project, this is probably one of the biggest projects in aeronautics. It takes up a huge percentage of the funding because they're building a new X-plane, which I showed in a previous slide. There you see on the right, and of course the goals are to have low sonic boom, create business jets and commercial airliners, which are supersonic, and bring back supersonic travel. And NASA is really, I would say, the global leader in this effort. And it's a lot of fun to get involved. I have a sonic boom program, which is supported by this program through a student fellowship, and it's been a lot of fun. If you've been reading the news, you'll see that hypersonic technology is huge right now. There's lots of funding, and basically the Russian Federation, the People's Republic of China, and of course the United States are all looking at hypersonics. And I'm getting new funding lines for hypersonics right now through the DoD, and maybe in the future NASA. That would be nice, but remember, NASA focuses on civilian work. The DoD is looking at, of course, weaponization of hypersonic technology. Hypersonics, in a maybe a bad definition, a lazy definition, not mathematical, and it says any vehicle that flies at 5 times the speed of sound and faster. And here's one NASA test vehicle, the X-43A. It did fly. This is just the artist's rendition. You can't just go out and take a picture of it in flight because it's moving so fast. And they focus on everything to the extreme that goes into a vehicle. Propulsion, combustion, aerodynamics, structures, materials, and high temperatures, and systems analysis, and guidance and control. And a lot of hypersonics do use star tracking to get where they're going, because enemy cannot interfere with star tracking usually. So those are just some things to think about. It's a great field. If you're at University of Florida, we have someone named Ryan Gossi. He's the hypersonics program lead. I put his email there on the left. He's a really nice guy, a great guy. I like talking to him. And he can help you guide your research into hypersonics. It's part of his position. So we're really lucky to have him. And he has lots of experience in hypersonics in the industry. Let's return to vertical lift. So vertical lift, we show some nominal flight vehicles here, all kinds of different kinds. Some are traditional, more traditional, and some are electric driven like eVTOL aircraft. And they have lots of research themes, which I've shown in the lower left, like icing, hover performance, internal cabin work, crash worthiness. And this is really a growth industry in the United States. Case in point, University of Florida is working with Archer Aviation, and they're dedicating a building on our campus in the fall, I believe. And they're funding multiple professors and students to do aerodynamic and acoustic studies on their type of vehicles. And we believe that this is a growth area. There's many universities in the United States with many professors who are fully funded and overwhelmed with the amount of work going into these vehicles. And there's, as I mentioned before, multiple billions of dollars going into their development in China, the United States, and Europe, and maybe a few other countries. But those are the 3 biggest players in this field. And I noted that Peter Ifew here, who's a mechanical and aero professor, is really point of contact for this type of work. But we also have a lot of other people doing all kinds of work for these types of vehicles on campus and controls and other fields. There's Aircraft Operations and Safety Program. I already talked about this. That's next gen. So I put one of the next gen satellite integration slides on the right. Let's not spend too much on time on that. But you can basically see if you're maybe in the natural sciences and looking at weather systems or maybe even ocean systems, we need to know weather prediction more accurately in the future for not only air traffic control and routing, but how it affects local airports and all these other types of new vehicles like eVTOL. So there's all these weather prediction programs are being pulled in from NOAA integrated with the new technology. And I think it's a great opportunity for someone maybe in that field who wants to try something a little bit different and apply their work, you know, from the science of prediction of the atmospheric turbulence and weather and everything that goes with it into the airspace system. Decision tool making, that's optimization, that's controls folks again, and related fields. And of course, optimizing all this flight and doing it with all kinds of different vehicles in realistic environments. That's a really challenging problem. I see the big data AI people having a great opportunity here in the future. I mentioned air traffic management. It gets more complicated because we're introducing more types of flight vehicles. We don't just have commercial aircraft and military aircraft in the airspace system. Now we have drones, and the FAA just released drone rules, all licensing and everything. And we're going to have these eVTOL aircraft in the future. We're going to have drug delivery by small UAVs and other types of vehicles coming out of the DoD. So all this has to be taken into account in the next-gen air traffic system. Here's a screenshot from a few years ago of every commercial aircraft, I believe, over the United States. So you can see this is a huge issue. Every aircraft is unique. We know everything about every aircraft essentially through databases and maintenance logs and its position, altitude. We know the weather. How do we integrate all this to create a safer environment for people traveling that's more reliable and environmentally friendly? Some of that's done through V&V, which is a subject which is pretty popular. There's a few people who do it, I believe, at UF, but I don't know if they're integrated into this type of program. So that's another thing to think about. Here's another idea of unmanned aircraft systems in the air traffic. Obviously, if you're air traffic controller, traditionally you would be able to call through the radio any type of aircraft and give them directions and reroute them, hand them off to like local airports. If it's a UAV, a military UAV or a commercial one, how do you reach out to them? There's unfortunately so many different standards. All this has to be taken into account and standardized so that communication is seamless and uninterrupted and also secure. Another thing that I didn't mention is the need for security in aerospace through encryption technology and denying bad actors to sabotage our system. For example, not long ago, a number of hackers were able to infiltrate our pipeline system in the United States and cause gas problems. So we need to do the same for aerospace. Now, at NASA, they have an integrated aviation systems program. This is really more like flight testing and things, so it's very hard for university people to get involved, but maybe you could get involved in helping plan flight tests or get your technology on a flight test. Much like you would get a technology on ISS, you might be able to get a technology on flight testing. And there's a number of flight testing research facilities, which I've shown here on slide 68, and I'll let you peruse that at your leisure. There's Flight Loads Lab, Research Aircraft Integration. Dryden's a big test range, which if you're lucky you can visit because it's part of a military base. One such program is the demonstrator program for the supersonic demonstrator, the X-59, and that's where they're going to fly over communities and measure psychological response. So for people in psychology, there's lots of opportunities to understand the psychological annoyance of people to sonic boom and to minimize that. Of course, they also want to do testing of integrating all these systems in the National Aerospace Program. But there's a little less opportunities for that. The next one is advanced air mobility. So this means also integrating these new types of vehicles into all the systems here, which are shown on the left. And that can be helpful and something that a lot of people in electrical engineering, I feel, can get involved in, especially in the battery and energy storage development. Then there's something which a lot of universities get involved in, and that's the Transformative Aeronautics Concepts program. So there's a lot of students who are passionate about design and doing things. Well, it's very possible that in their design programs, not just in aerospace engineering, but other mechanical, industrial, chemical, electrical engineering can all provide components for a system level basic design. It could be a paper aircraft made on paper, or it could actually be a smaller aircraft to demonstrate. A lot of universities do that, and it's often cross-cutting. The nice thing at UF is in our department, we do bring in some students from other departments to work on these designs, which is kind of a cool thing. And these are often revolutionary concepts, so they're looking for new ideas that have never been tried before in aeronautics. We're almost there with these types of slides. Just to give you a broad overview of AMD, there's the Convergent Aeronautics Solutions Program, and they just invest a lot of money in improbable ideas to lead the solutions that overcome any of these major goals. So if you find that project manager and program manager online, they change a little bit, so I don't want to list all the names because I'd just be rewriting them. If you have a revolution idea, you can certainly reach out to them with a white paper, and if it's really good, they will fund it. I was often told at NASA that every good idea gets funding eventually. I think it's a good mindset to have, even though you might be rejected first. Another important program is the T program, Transformational Tools and Technologies. This is some of my bread and butter, but they focus, there's two major problems where we're not good at predicting things and don't know the physics very well. One is turbulence modeling and creating turbulence models, which is a state of flow in aerodynamics or fluid dynamics. And the other one is high temperature materials. As an example, this is an aerodynamic experiment that was done at Virginia Tech, funded by T. So that's like the major mainline NASA programs. Now there's two I want to talk about which are like specific for universities. The first one, and they're under the thing called the University Initiative Project. The first one is down in the lower left, University Leadership Initiative. And the second one is the Student Research Challenge. The University Initiative is a yearly call, and they usually fund between 3 and 6 university groups, between $3 and $6 million over 3 years. So it's a $2 to $2.5 million grant, maybe every year for 3 years. And they usually have 4 areas they pick, and a 5th one, which is sort of like open-ended. They always fund the 5th one, and the other 4 kind of competed more. And usually what happens is the call goes out a couple months ago, so we really missed this cycle if you wanted to get involved, and you look at the things they want to do. And you can have any idea you really want, and you can form a multi-university team and propose and lead one of these university-led initiatives. I, in my career, have applied to maybe 3 now, I think, and we haven't won. But I have really good friends who are same age, same part of their career at other universities, and they've won. And it's a really wonderful thing because you can work with people across universities to establish a program. And it's really seen as a growth program, because they would like you to take that program and push it, not only meeting NASA goals, but get industrial involvement, other universities, other parts of the government to help fund it and create it. So I think it's a great thing to look out every year. And if you're on the NSPIRE's email list sending, grant notifications from NSPIRE's NRA, then you'll get those emails and you'll see what the technology areas are or their emphasis, which changes every year. The next one, of course, is University Student Research Challenge. This one's also competed every year on a yearly basis, and I put the link down there. And if you want to get a large grant to work more with students and student design in any of these things I mentioned, which you can see involves almost every type of department at the university, even history, they even have history calls and grants through NASA, especially Aeronautics, then you can go after it this way. And then the grant's more for like paying for students and stuff. Especially undergrads, and of multi-university too. It could be you could work with a historically Black institution, for example. So any of those things would be absolutely awesome. NASA has ARMD outside of all that a test and evaluation capabilities. So when you write a grant for NASA, you can always propose to work with one of these facilities, which is a great opportunity. And they have some of the most state-of-the-art facilities in the world. Now, I'm really aeronautics, aerodynamics, turbulence, acoustics type person, so I'm going to kind of talk, I have a little bit of bias, but they have lots of facilities. Every center website talks in depth about every one of those facilities. And if you contact the facilities people through those websites of each center, you can actually get like PDFs of all the capabilities of all their facilities. And you are encouraged when you write a grant to integrate those facilities into your proposal. So let's just look at a few. And I just did wind tunnels for an example, so you can see an example. But they have these types of slides and PDFs for everything. These are all NASA facilities, and for subsonic tunnels, they've just listed a few. In interest of time and maybe relation, I'll just keep going through them. Transonic tunnels, supersonic tunnels, and hypersonic tunnels. For example, you can see I was at NASA LARC, Langley Research Center, for 7 years. So you can see for these slides, LARC is on every slide. It's really a place where they had more wind tunnels than anywhere else in the world at one time. But whatever, you can just try and align your research with a particular facility. I have maybe another 5 or 7 minutes, so I want to focus on just the calls and the centers and what they do historically, so you can align your proposals with facilities or other things there. Almost all the ARMD calls go through, of course, NSPIRE's. You can find an account there, and they're also, if you just Google NSPIRE's NASA, go to the website, you can register with your ID and associate your institution. They also have like an open solicitation call. It's probably updated ROA 2021 now. You can also find that on NSPIRE's, I believe, or under solicitations at this link. So check it out. You can see all the details about writing a proposal. All the NRAs are through NSPIRE's. They're all peer-reviewed anonymously. You do get your feedback automatically from the reviewers, which is great. You don't have to request it like some organizations. And every award really originates from centers. They're center-driven by the researchers, and you get a technical monitor who's usually a researcher, not necessarily the program manager. And the technical monitor who's a researcher, a NASA researcher full-time, except for maybe monitoring a few grants and contracts, will report to the project manager and make recommendations. The ROAs are always coming through NRA updates, and I encourage you to register, as I just mentioned. And it's that simple to find the calls. You can also find sole source funding. That means that if you know a researcher at NASA and they have the project manager's ear, you can actually just write a what amounts to a large white paper, and they can write you a direct funded check to do something. It could be do some objectives or just kind of like a more open thing to provide research. And those are wonderful to get. They're very hard to get because a sole source funded grant means that you are essentially the only person in the world who can do that type of work. And that takes a very strong and powerful researcher in the NASA organization to convince a program manager that you are, in fact, the only person who can do this. I'm sure we believe we are, but they have to believe it too. And we can provide evidence there. So I've seen and written and monitored a few of these sole source things in my career. With the last few minutes, I just want to look at centers and just their history so you understand what they do at each center, so maybe you can align your research with them. In each slide, I have a picture of the center from the air. So this is NASA Langley Research in the upper right. That little hangar at the bottom, that's where the Space Task Group started. That's where NASA really started, in that building. It's still there today. It's a historic building. And the top of the picture at the end of the road is actually my building. You can see in the lower right, there's NASA Langley at the marker, and you can see Washington, D.C. is in the northern part of the state. The Revolutionary War and the Civil War both had battles of Yorktown, which is right nearby, including the Ironclad Battle, which happened in the bay just south of Hampton. Anyway, it was founded in 1917, establishing the first airstrip and field center for NACA. 2/3 of the program today is aeronautics and 1/3 is in space, and every part of R&D exists at NASA Lark. The second center was founded in 1939. And if you've ever been to the Bay Area of San Francisco, you can go down and check out NASA Ames, which I marked on the map at the bottom of the bay, very close to Google and Facebook and all these tech companies, and of course Stanford. Here's the picture in the upper part. You can see these giant buildings up here are wind tunnels, and they actually have a building that held dirigibles, which are like blimps. NASA supercomputing is also located at this location. The third center in 1942 is Glenn, which is in Ohio. So here's the red mark in the lower left of the map, NASA Glenn Research Center, and you can see there's downtown Cleveland in the upper right. And there's the air view picture. It's actually part of the Cleveland Airport, so if you ever fly to Cleveland, it's actually a really awesome city. I love going there. I've been there many times to visit this center. It's part of my previous position. And you can see it's kind of a compact center, but it's part of the airport. So you just take the taxi around the airport to get in. So it's a really great place to go meet up researcher or program manager. And they do focus more on propulsion and propulsion systems of all types. NASA Advanced Supercomputing is an Ames, which deserves its own slide. Anytime you write a NASA grant or proposal, you should write in language like, I would like to have access to this. You don't have to ask for any more money. They'll just allocate you 100,000 hours, 200,000 hours, whatever you want on this computer. And this computer is dominated. NASA supercomputing is dominated by aeronautics, especially in turbulence calculations. That's where almost all the computer power is going. And but that doesn't mean anything can't be run on NASA. If you need the computing power, you might not even worry about running on Hypergator. Just say, I want to run on this, and that'll save you some money in your proposal that you can direct there. There's also the NASA Aeronautics Research Institute. I only have a few more slides. Please bear with me. And this is more of like an outside organization that funds research. So besides that NSPIRES process, you might go to this little website down here, narrate.arc.nasa.gov. See, that's Ames Research Center, nasa.gov. And they have a whole different awards process, and they fund research and they fund education stuff. So it's kind of like outside the normal ARMD NSPIRES process. This is just another funding line I encourage you to look at. Smaller grants, but hey, it might get a student through your program. Dryden Research Center was founded in 1946 after World War II. It certainly existed during World War II, but the NACA NASA part was found there. It's inside Edwards Air Force Base, so if you're in Los Angeles and you go north of the Angeles National Forest, you can go and see the Armstrong Flight Center. It was actually renamed after Neil Armstrong after he passed away. It was originally named after Hugh Dryden, who was an early researcher and administrator of NASA. And there's many famous programs there in aeronautics and astronautics. For example, this prototypical lunar lander type vehicle and trainer. Now, in my last slides, I want to talk about what facilities are in Florida that you might check out. University of Florida facilities. Our college has made this amazing faculty research website. Click on it, go check it out. And if you're in like the areas I am, you might go look at the combustion lab, the wind tunnels, and the unstudied fluid dynamics group of my colleague, Dr. Larry Ukiley. But anything in here, it's good to team up multidisciplinary proposals and grants, have better chances of winning, I think, especially if NASA RMD, they really look favorably on multi-university, multi-discipline. So check that out. There's too many to list here to be its own presentation. Guess what? If you're in Florida, you're part of the Florida Center for Advanced Aero Propulsion. Congratulations. And we have all these facilities across Florida State, Florida Central, and Embry-Riddle, I believe, that are part of this consortium. And you can use any of these facilities. You're encouraged to use them and team up with people who run them when you write your grants. So check those links out. Embry-Riddle, I wanted to point out, has a new $10 million subsonic wind tunnel. It was partly sponsored by the state of Florida, and of course, we're encouraged to use it if you want to get into that world. So that's the end of my presentation today. I really thank you for your time. We have maybe 5 or 7 minutes for any questions, which I'll look at in the chat or just unmute. We covered a lot of stuff today, so I'm sure there's lots of things to think about, but the big takeaways is get into NSPIRES, read the proposal formats, look for sole source funding, look at some of the outside edge cases like NARI, get your high performance computing time if you're in numerics from Ames. You don't have to spend money on that, just say I want to use that and they'll let you. It's very important to find excellent researchers at NASA through conferences who can become your champions, and talk to those program and project managers to convince them that your research is really valuable, and explain how it meets the NASA overarching goals. And I know you'll be successful in building a program. So thank you.